Well, I'm glad to see all of you here today. I'm very excited to talk about this subject for a lot of reasons, and because we're on a fairly tight schedule, I'm going to begin. So, the a lot of what I'm doing today is going to be based off of the PowerPoint stack. So just let me know if you can see this. It says University is on fire. There are a couple of grim-looking graphs on the right. So I'm a futurist. My name is Bryan Alexander. I work in the future of higher education, and I've been in this field for quite some time. What I'm presently looking at is one slice of that larger pie. I'm focusing on the future of higher education during the age of the climate crisis. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today as we think about what happens to higher education, as we think about what it means in terms of technology and space. We need to keep in mind what's happening with our own transformation of the planet. And what that means for higher education is something that's very, very complex. And I'd like to dive into it. Now, to do that, I'd like to hit a couple of different topics. And a few different ways. So first, I just want to remind you that this is perhaps the largest driver of change that we have for higher education. The climate crisis is so large that it more or less constitutes a separate category of analysis of something called the hyperobject. It is enormously deep and moving very, very quickly. So today I'm going to try to really narrow it down and focus on a few things at once. So what we're going to explore is how higher education engages with the climate crisis. So the first has to do with the impact on campus grounds, so those of you who have physical buildings. Second, what it does to a research enterprise. And third, what it does to teaching. And all of that is within our academic unit. And then we'll go further and take a look at how this connects with our community relations, and then how this connects with how academia connects with the world as a whole, and then see what next, what happens, what's likely to occur over the next, say, 75 to 80 years. Now, the way we're going to do this, again, we're in a fairly tight schedule, and I want to make sure that we can maximize our time together, is I'm going to be sharing with you some of the research and forecasts I've been doing. And then I'm going to interrupt that sharing to ask you to write about how your individual work might or should change in the course of this enormous future. And so I'd like you to do that by using the chat box first, but also off to one side in a Google Doc, Word document, whatever you like. Start taking some notes, because I'm going to be asking you some formal questions, and I'm going to want to bring all those answers back together at the end. So just get your fingers ready, loosened up, and let's just start sharing your thoughts as we go. And of course, I'd love to be interrupted with comments and questions. So let me just remove a couple of things in the interest of time that we're not going to talk about. We can't do Climate Change 101 right now. That's easy to do, and I can point you resources if you like. We're going to focus on a macro picture, or I'm going to focus on the macro picture of the entirety of higher education globally. But it's your job to bring in the micro picture of your individual situations. This is a very long-term trend, by the way. I'm talking about 75 to 80-year scope, and it goes further than that. So some of these issues are going to be large, it take a lot of time, more than a typical 5-year plan. And there's also room for plenty of variations by geography, by institutional type, and all kinds of ways. So just to assume a couple of things, there's a lot of different variations about where climate change could take us over the next 75 to 80 years. So broadly speaking, there are kind of 3 main bands we could talk about. There's the optimistic band, where humanity actually gets its act together and we more or less get things under control, and maybe we're supported by some benevolent disasters. A more extreme version, the worst case, is when the climate increases in temperature by more than 5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. This is actually such a bad scenario that people have a hard time researching it. There isn't a lot of writing about it. What I'd like you to work with is somewhere in between those, where the temperature rises more than 2 degrees centigrade, that we have some collective action, some civilizational programs and transformation, but we also pass a few major tipping points, such as having the ice sheet in Antarctica or the ice sheet in Greenland melt, or the gigantic Atlantic major currents cuts down drastically or stops working. So we're in a crisis zone. And I'd like you to think about your own work your own campus, your own institution in two ways. First is what I call protective action, the immediate thing of what we need to do to protect ourselves from threats. But the second is to how your campus population participates in the broader, not just conversation, but the broader action about climate change. And these two overlap, but they aren't necessarily the same. So let's start off by thinking about your own individual campus, your college, your university, your library, your institution. And we think about this in terms of, first of all, sea level rise. I mean, you can find a lot of maps like this where people try to project where sea level rise could go. And I think it's interesting to note that in the United States situation here, as well as in parts of northern South America and parts of Central America, you can see coastlines, which are now presently dotted with quite a few colleges and universities, simply subsumed. Take a look at what happens to Florida, for example, or inland Louisiana, or just inside of San Francisco, Golden Gate Bridge. And you can find examples of this starting to happen right now. The state of Florida has already made decisions about some of the Florida Keys, those little tiny islands, either to protect them against sea level rise or to write them off. One of my favorite examples comes from Miami-Dade County, where that county is desperately trying to figure out how to protect itself from sea level rise. Already, that's an area that's subjected to massive amounts of flooding, including the truly disturbing sunny day flooding when there's no storm, but a massive flood happens anyway. The reason this matters is just take a look at this. Let me zoom in here. Just look at this quick scan of how many colleges and universities are dotted right there, either on the Atlantic coast or just a few blocks inland. In fact, if we zoom in even further, if we look at the campuses that are right on the Atlantic, here's 6, 7, 8 right now at risk. So that flooding risk is a major one to think about. And this occurs around the world. Bangladesh, for example, is especially dangerous. Some small island countries are really, really at risk. Here's from the capital of Indonesia. And I say the capital, this is from Jakarta. They're actually relocating the capital because Jakarta is at sea level and is starting to subside. So what happens to a university like this? Or what happens to other effects that aren't necessarily just flooding? Think, for example, about universities in Britain's Lake District, where the natural beauty matters a great deal. Some of you may be at a college or university that has a similar beautiful, attractive location. But what happens when the temperature goes up 2, 3, 4 degrees centigrade? What happens when the water quality changes? When different life forms, from bacteria to flora to fauna, move in or move out? What happens when the very nature of your campus changes? How does that transform your own institution? Now, we can talk about some of these, but I want to dive into the physical campus a bit and just show you some of the ways this plays out. We think about campus buildings, for example, and to what extent we should make them carbon zero. That is, they do not emit any net carbon in the process of the construction and operation, or net negative, where the building itself may draw down some carbon dioxide. We think about campuses or buildings being constructed out of new materials that use less CO2 in their construction, or we use experimental practices such as moving old building parts together to make new ones, demountable buildings. We could think as well about campuses that have to erect barriers against water or desert. And we do have quite a few campuses around the world that are at the edge of expanding deserts, including the United States. We may think about elevating buildings, putting them on stilts in different ways in order to allow dangerous areas to pass underneath, or physically upping stakes completely and removing a campus away from danger zones. Think about electrical power. Most campuses around the world outsource their electricity to elsewhere, mostly to coal burning and oil burning plants. So should we outsource that in a different way? Should we make a point of finding a different source for our power? Berea College in Kentucky in the United States, for example, just purchased its second hydropower plant off campus, but in order to get away from coal. How many campuses will start installing more power sources there, be it solar or wind or hydro or geothermal? How many will start doing research and development on campus into new technologies for providing that kind of power, such as giant wind turbines or new types of solar cells? And then think about computing. This is what draws a serious amount of electricity on campus. We have to think about how computing changes. On the one hand, I'm going to get into this a bit more, is the idea that because travel uses so much CO2 and expends so much CO2, we should travel less, which means campuses should do more virtually. So perhaps green computing means a more and more virtual campus. On the other hand, Computing itself uses CO2, both in the construction of the infrastructure and in its operation. So perhaps green computing means using less computationally intensive functions on campus. And then we have other parts of campus. Our food, for example, food systems, depending on your measurement, contribute something like 10 to 14% of humanity's greenhouse gases. So do we push, for example, to more local food that uses less transportation? On our campus cafeterias and food service, do we offer less in the way of meat and other animal products? What do we do with our campus green spaces? Do we expand them and, for example, say, get rid of parking lots or roads and turn them over to more trees, more ponds and creeks? And that brings us to transportation. Do we still allow fossil fuel burning vehicles on our campus? Do we allow students to bring them on campus, or do we start disincentivizing them or banning them outright? Think about some of the projects we see in architecture. This is one from Milan, Italy, this is actually a difficult thing to pull off in order to have greenery on a vertical scale from hallways, from windows, and from balconies. And this is a present day project. Think as well about some of the visions that we see under the header of solar punk, where we try to imagine a deep green future where campuses are just filled and replete with greenery and with water. So I mentioned all of this, and then I want to add one more part. I mentioned travel before. There's already the idea that we should cut back our air travel. A Swedish word, flygskam, describes flight shaming, when you take a plane when instead you could take a train. Well, should we cut back academic travel, faculty and staff who travel to professional events and to research and so on? Should we move to just continuous webinars for conferences or some form of high-flex meetings? There's a lot of resistance to this within higher education. And one of the reasons is that it can't always be done equally. Not every campus has the ability to mount a fully virtual presence. Furthermore, we think about new people or people new in their career, especially younger scholars, who really need that face-to-face immersion in order to meet a lot of people, or so goes the argument. How will we be able to do this? So all of this is the campus. All this is campus operations. I just threw a bunch at you. But what I want to do now is ask you two questions about this. Again, having to do with your own individual institution. The first is, what would green computing look like at your institution? Would it mean more computing or less computing or different in some way? So again, you can jot a note about this in the chat, but also write something about this in some other document, Word document, Google Doc, or whatever. And along with it, when you're thinking about that, who would lead the charge for green computing on campus? Would it come from the IT department? Would it come from trustees? Would it come from students? I'll give you a minute to think about this. If you want to put questions in the chat, this is just absolutely great. Tom Ames points out that he aims to teach his community college students about complexity in systems so they can start to wrap their heads around the wide range of policies that'll be necessary to maintain even that middle path. Very good. It's a good pedagogical answer. And then Noah Whitman says storage and compute purchased from cloud vendors. Green offerings are the competitive advantage. So, okay, so for Noah's institution, green computing would mean more cloud computing. Very good. And then Roxanne, hello, Roxanne, my friend. Roxanne says, considering students might be interested in investigating digital clothing and awareness that can save CO2. Yeah. Lots of student drivers. Very good. All right, well, put your pens down for a second. And we need to advance a little bit further. Gus Leonard, hello, Gus. This summer, I'm working on our new LEED Platinum building built in 2019, noticing that my office temperature was 81.5 yesterday afternoon. I'm going to assume that's Fahrenheit. Is that deliberate? I mean, is that Is that a policy in the building to not have the AC running as high as normal? There's no AC, so it's relying on ambient temperature and on design. Very good. So this is one thing to think about. There's actually at least one book on the subject of how air conditioning is kind of problematic. It emits the production of air conditioning systems use CO2, but also when ACs are operating, they burn a lot of electrical power. They also emit some other greenhouse gases. There's an interesting argument that we need to cut back our AC. So think about campuses that have any kind of physical presence in very, very warm climates and how feasible that will be. And he's in Central Coast, California, about 3/4 of a mile off the ocean. Should be able to get some great praises from there. Tom says we need fluid environments that avoid unnecessary trips to campus. We can be smarter about how we deliver learning. Tom, if you want to write a bit more about that in either your in chat or in your document, that would be great. Need to advance a little further. This is great. This is good thinking. I hope you're all feeling your brains start to stretch a little further and a little further. I want to go on and to hit another topic, which is what happens to research. So on that campus, of course, depending on the campus, you have some proportion of your faculty and some staff conducting research. How does that change in the climate crisis? Well, we know that many disciplines, in fact, just about all disciplines can do research in climate change. I mean, it obviously fields like atmospherics and planetary science, earth science, obviously do a lot of work on this, meteorology, but also we see this really across the curriculum. And for example, we see psychologists who are doing research into what it means to have somebody lose their climate they grew up with, or to see a space that they loved change drastically. We've seen political scientists who are trying to examine what happens to political sovereignty as states try to struggle with what they can do and what they should do. In the humanities, we've seen the environmental humanities that looks at environmental literature, environmental philosophy, and so on. So we also see a transdisciplinary kind of work where people are able to look at this problem and cut across all these fields. So for example, if you're trying to be an economist and trying to cost out how people approach the climate crisis, well, you may have to dip into earth science to do this, as well as some psychology and behavioral psychology just to get things going. Just here are a couple of interesting examples from the humanities to point out. On the right, you can see the current Pope issued a long document about the climate crisis. So to analyze that requires, of course, religious studies. And the left is an interesting visualization exercise, trying to get people to think about how temperatures change. So if you look at on the left there, A and B, B is what the temperature looks like right now. Imagine in A, it would end up feeling like what B looks like now. So there's a lot that can be done from this. Think too about how fields expand or contract. I mean, in terms of numbers. So you can imagine a field like meteorology just continuing to grow as more and more people are interested in this, or civil engineering. And perhaps some fields that don't manage to engage with the crisis may contract as a population of students who are increasingly interested in this vote with their feet. We could see new domains and new disciplines appear. And we also would see political challenges within institutions as people resent a focus on climate change or want more of it. Now, supporting research becomes even trickier still because you think that some physical sites and locations and some materials are in danger. So you think about, for example, ancient human remains on the nation of Malta, or you think about biological preserves that are in shallow seas, which are all in danger of being subsumed or transformed drastically by rising sea levels and rising temperatures. We also have to deal with political pressures that may be exerted upon our research. So think about someone who's researching alternative energy who may be under attack by climate deniers. The question I'd like to ask you all now to think about is how would you support digitizing your institution's research enterprise? So think, for example, of an archaeologist who's working on a Roman site that's on the Mediterranean Sea. And within 20 years, that site is going to be wiped out by climate change. Do we scan that? Do you push really hard for photogrammetry kind of level scanning or VR? Or does your campus decide to help move that site to a safer location? Think about as well faculty who have to travel to an archive location because it hasn't been digitized yet. How do you support faculty doing that? So take a minute. either jot this in the chat or in your attached document and put down a few notes about how you would support digitizing that research enterprise. Thank you, Tom, for sharing that quote. And thank you, Roxanne, for that link. Noah points out 3D laser scanning. So think about how you can invest in exploring such technologies, rolling them out, supporting them, teaching people how to use them, as well as preserving the results. Gus Leonard mentions the COIL approach to international experiences as a way to bring international perspectives into the classroom without hitting the road, which is really, really important. It gives a link to SUNY's COIL instance. Very good. I think interested on the one hand, we can think about the technical challenges of that. Roxanne mentions the metaverse or using NFTs. Roxanne, are you thinking about, say, attaching an NFT to an endangered research site? And we just quickly ask everybody, are we going too fast, too slow, or just the right speed? Nobody responded, which makes you think perhaps you were all dead. Okay, you're good. All right, Bailey's good. All right. Sarah points out a great point that it really depends on the research area. So you could think about some fields now that are entirely digital that wouldn't be that greatly impacted. But some of them are really just, in many ways, really dependent on physical sites that are in danger. All right, well, let's move on. Let's push on because I want to make sure I respect everybody's time. And there's still more to talk about. Let's think about teaching. In many ways, for a lot of us, the focus of higher education. How does this change? Well, we can imagine curricula changing, and that is they have to reflect transformations of research. I mean, a lot of faculty research gets plugged into teaching. There's also the idea of decolonizing classes, decolonizing pedagogy, decolonizing the curriculum, which can intersect pretty powerfully with climate change. And there's also the idea of new academic programs, colleges, or even schools dedicated to climate change, either to climate mitigation or to climate adaptation. Our pedagogies may change as well. Think, for example, about using project-based learning. We already know that's a very powerful tool for understanding environmental issues. The same is true for inquiry-based learning, and the same goes for simulations and gaming. So we may see more of those being deployed across the curriculum. We may also see more collective work and collective assessment. The argument here is interesting. The idea that perhaps one of the things that got us into this mess was too much individualism, focused on individual greed, individual identity, and not enough attention on social costs, or what economists call externalities. So perhaps a solution will be to make our culture more socially oriented, more communal. Well, if that's the case, American education is hyper individualistic. That's how we structure what we teach, even when we push out content to large numbers of people. So perhaps one response will be to do more group work, to have more group assessment, more collective work. That's another angle that we may pursue. And then you also to think about whom we teach. That is, our populations are already changing. We know this. We could talk about that if you like, but think about this. How many of our populations will come to us increasingly having experienced the climate crisis? That is, a student who maybe lost a home due to sea level rise, or another student who had to leave home because it was swamped by desert, or whose families had their livelihoods wrecked by, say, advancing prairies or disease. So increasingly, we have to be aware of our student populations as climate veterans, in effect. And then we also have this issue of intergenerational tension. I mean, polls after polls show that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be exercised and excited about the climate crisis, and the older vice versa. So we may see that tension play out on campuses. I mean, think about students who demand more climate curriculum, for example. So I have a couple of questions to ask you about this. The first is, when it comes to teaching, how quickly and how far could you scale up online learning? That is, if your campus has to teach more and more online for all the reasons we've been talking about. And again, you could put an answer to that in the chat, or you could put an answer to that in your document. Noah's in a good spot. No, does your institution already have a relationship with those entities, with EDX or Coursera or Canvas?
All three.
Excellent, excellent. Um, and so you can immediately go to scale with that. So the MOOC providers can be very helpful for this. Good point. Sarah San Gregorio, hello Sarah, it's really good to see you. She writes, in the pandemic, they gave us support staff. They gave support staff a week to get our faculty up online. It's probably a similar timeline to now. So the answer is quickly but badly, quickly but with a shambles perhaps, or just way too much stress on poor faculty, poor staff. And Annie Brintup says pretty quickly, because they have a good team now. You're well equipped. Good for you. Good for you. Certain ones, it depends on if you get more support. So it may be that thinking of the climate crisis is an argument for more staff support for this. All right, let me add a question to this one. How might you support new pedagogies for a curriculum increasingly focused on the climate crisis? That is, will there be greater demand for simulations and gaming, project-based learning or inquiry-based learning? And if that's the case, how would you support that demand? How would you help faculty do that kind of teaching? And if you're already doing that work, please say so. That's fine. So Noah recommends fostering communities of practice that live beyond the typical course cycle. Great. No, and would those be within academic disciplines or cross-disciplinary?
I think they could be both.
Very good. And Tom Hames recommends institutions need to stop thinking about support, information support, academic support, design, mental health as a secondary function and more as a primary function, if I read you rightly, Tom. Very good. Well, I wanted to ask another question about that, but I'm going to save that for later because it's a tricky one, and I want to hit it from a different angle. Sarah says that more creative staff for digital videos and simulations. Yes, most folks don't have the capacity to build it on their own. Quite true. However, the best courses she has are discussion-based. We need to open dialogues outside the normal academic paradigm. That's a powerful call, Sarah. Excellent, excellent point. Now, all of these campuses, if in some degree with relation with a community nearby. They may be urban campuses or rural campuses, but we have to think about those populations in terms of the climate crisis. Well, for example, do we work with local efforts about this, such as a city-based effort to decarbonize or to switch cars to electrical or to put out more hydropower? Now, physically, do we support climate migrants? And this is one of the great terrible things that we have to worry about for the climate crisis. That is, that people live in the most dangerous areas, especially around the equator, are likely to start moving because of their regions becoming dangerous to inhabit, if not completely uninhabitable. So we're talking about potentially millions of migrants. So does this become something that campuses do as a kind of community effort? Do we also participate with economic development in our community? That is, if there's, say, a burgeoning solar power industry for installation and support, do we join with that as part of our climate strategy? And then how do we embrace climate justice on the local level? Think, for example, about building a seawall. Many cities who are on the coast are thinking about this or working on it right now. Boston, New York City, for example, are too. Well, what happens if you build a seawall narrowly in the frontage of your city, protecting, say, the wealthiest core of it, but water rises and smashes against it and laps around either side? It's going to hit the areas that are largely poorer, perhaps more rural, perhaps not of the dominant ethnicity. We have to think about how to balance our efforts to mitigate and adapt to the climate in a way that is just. And then we also have local politics. That is, we have policies that can be imposed on us locally. And the effects of climate change can hit politics. So, for example, if an area is suffering from a terrible drought, this might exacerbate local violence or political unrest. And then economics gets especially twisted by this. That is, we could see property values warp up or down. That if you have wonderful property on, say, the Great Lakes, this will become less and less powerful, which may make it harder for you to raise money, which may depress the local economy. Or the reverse, property in Appalachia may become valuable for the first time in history. We could also see tax policies change as a result. So the question I want to put to you is, how might you respond to climate pressure from a local community, either pro-climate action or anti-climate action? Again, you can put this in the chat, you can turn your microphone on and holler at us, or add to your document that you're writing on. Noah, who's definitely taking the lead here, says no or low-cost online educational programs can reach climate refugees. Yes. This got some mockery back about 6 years ago when in the big glory days of MOOCs, there were efforts to try to make MOOCs available for migrants, and people say, this is not what they need. That's quite wrong. Migrants need all kinds of post-secondary education. If they're moving to a country where they don't speak the language, for example, language instruction for a culture or history, politics of a local area, plus recertifying in a trade or a profession. ESL courses, professional certificates, absolutely. So thinking about our ability to expand classes online, this is one angle to do that. Tom, can you share a link to the blog post you mentioned? Annie Printup mentions her institution has been discussing flexible scheduling and work from home capabilities, and the admins aren't very keen on it. Well, climate change may really push that. So that working from home may be the most climate-friendly solution. Maybe. Thanks, Tom, for sharing that link. I'm conscious of time, friends, and I want to get some more group discussion. So I'm going to add one more point just to widen this and get really challenging. We think about our campuses and as campuses. We think about them in their local communities. Well, now I want to expand to what it means to be an academic in a world in crisis, in the climate crisis. For example, and these are open questions right now, how many academics will feel comfortable about being public intellectuals, about deploying the intellectual armature of their discipline to the world for a general audience? How will we preserve fields that are in crisis right now? Should we help lead mitigation or adaptation efforts in the world as a whole? Should we support climate migrants online, as Noah was suggesting? Do we in fact form global alliances, academic alliances dedicated to intervene? If this is a crisis that is likely to result in agony and death of millions at least, perhaps this is a case where academia needs to exit the ivory tower role and take a more activist role. And it might not be our decision to do that. It might be a decision that's taken for us by, say, a state government or a national government, or a board of trustees, or a faculty or student body. And we also have changes in the world that we might not have any role in making, but may still swamp us. So new models of economics, for example, I recommend taking a look at the donut economic model, which I can't summarize here, or the circular one, which is more of a kind of no growth one where people recycle all kinds of materials and services. We may see emergency authorities emerge in certain areas as the crisis really takes off. We may, of course, see a major decolonization movement, which really plays out along climate lines. We're already seeing arguments with that this month in Germany. Or how academia responds to geoengineering projects, which could happen anywhere from the oceans to the atmosphere, to space, to the land. And of course, doing this in terms of justice, as I mentioned before. And there are a lot of angles for this. I recommend these two books. Breeding Sweetgrass is a powerful exploration of blending modern botanical science and science in general with indigenous ways of knowing. And Amitav Ghosh's book really anchors the climate crisis in a long history of colonization. So a question to ask you is, how does educational technology change at your campus if your society shifts to a circular or no growth economy? So think about your surrounding state or province or nation. If the idea is that perpetual GDP growth stops, and the idea now is to stop growing so much, but instead to recycle goods, materials, and services, to hold on to materials for longer, and not to be in that kind of perpetual growth cycle. How does that change educational technology at your institution? Tom Hames jumps in and says immediately we have to fundamentally restructure most business schools. Yes, there's some really interesting discussion going on about that right now, Tom. Good point. Sarah Gregorio points out that being a public intellectual is harder now due to the rising anti-education sentiment in the US. Yes, the question is, Sarah, how does an academic institution support that? Or does it not? Does it hold back? Give you guys about 30 seconds more to say some more stuff. I bet the notes you're taking are growing rapidly. Tom adds that we need to make education more accessible. We'll never let climate change if no one understands it. Remember that enrollment in American higher ed has been going down for 10 years, so we're going the opposite way. Noah suggests that we may see even fewer tenured positions. That may be true, where if colleges and universities face further declines to revenue, then that incentivizes them to have support more part-time positions among faculty. Sarah points out that she works for a business school, so she has to abstain from further discussion. I understand, S. We won't repeat that. Roxanne recommends that libraries play a more intentional role. Yeah. Roxanne, are you thinking of public libraries or academic libraries? Very good. I think about libraries offering access to knowledge, learning of all kinds. Again, both academic and public, not to mention access to infrastructure. Very good, Tom. So let me just try and sum this up and point a little bit ahead from where we are. Think about all of our discussions so far. We can add COVID to the mix. I know, right? Just oh my God, more. But just think about this for a second, because the experience of COVID has given us some interesting insights into how we might respond to the climate crisis. It's given us a glimpse of what it means to cut back emissions. You might remember some of those astonishing photos from 2020, where entire economies shut down, the skies cleared up. It may also give us a way to think about connecting climate with social justice, and just kind of giving us a whole series of insights about how we might respond to a similar civilization-wide natural crisis, how nations interacted, how economies reacted, how we politicize science. It may be that what we now do is we rethink and redesign higher ed in terms of these issues, the research dimension, the teaching dimension, the community and world dimension. It may be that we don't. It may be that academia pulls back. We may reserve our energies for efforts of bigger impact, such as lobbying for changes to a national budget or for changes to the human diet rather than campus food service. Academics are already overburdened. We're already stressed and wounded from the past few years of COVID, as well as political unrest. We may want to remain autonomous from politics, which is a classic political stance for a lot of academics. And as Sarah pointed out, as S pointed out, we have a whole bunch of anti-academic sentiment out there rising. So perhaps we don't want to get involved with the climate crisis. I'd recommend for all of you a few steps. One is to plan their engagement strategically. To think about this at the big scale. Prepare for short-term change as well as long-term change. And it's hard to assess the different speeds of those. Our participation in this kind of planning has to be democratic, lowercase d. It has to be just. It has to have the voices that are normally voiceless or marginalized. And we may have to rethink higher education as a whole. I think, for example, about the argument that I'm seeing out there, that higher education played a constructive role in making the climate crisis happen. We, after all, produced petroleum engineers and economists and scientists of all kinds who helped make industrial civilization what it is now. We produced agricultural scientists who helped produce methane in the long run. To what extent are we culpable? To what extent do we have to reformat and redesign higher education for this crisis? I'll leave you with two images. One is this solar punk idea. This is some art by an artist called Imperial Boy. And think about a campus or a world that looks like this, which I think in many ways is an optimistic vision. And I also want to leave you with the title of my new book, Universities on Fire. I mean, both universities that face fire literally, that face damage and destruction, but they also face the fire of passionate interest and political movements on campus, in addition to fire as a source of illumination. So let me stop all these slides here. We have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to hear from all of you. Take a look at the document you've been working on. Think about your plan for moving forward. What do you think of this now? Where do you think you can take your institution, or at least your part of the institution, as the climate crisis deepens? Again, feel free to use the chat. I'll read it out loud. And if you'd like to just uncork your microphone, we'd love to hear from you out loud.
Well, since it's sort of tradition for me to speak at a Bryan Alexander event.
Oh, no.
I don't have to be invited here. No, the point that the through thread that I was trying to make with my comments is that, if we rethink how we use our campuses, and that, we don't have to herd thousands of students onto campus on a schedule. We don't have to herd the faculty that support those thousands of students on schedule to campus, that we can significantly reduce the amount of transit and how we use that transit. We can also think about how we can use those campuses at different times of the day or night to maybe fit people's schedules, but also air conditioning is cheaper in the middle of the night in Phoenix, and less disruptive to, creating climate. It's not going to generate as much of a demand problem. So there's all sorts of little ways. I mean, I think the thing we often get overwhelmed with climate change is, oh my God, this is such a huge problem, we're all going to die. But there's so many things that we can do, and so many little ways we can teach people to do, but also we can, think about doing on our campuses that do not necessarily involve tearing down every building on campus and rebuilding them in a green fashion. But, to just start to think about how our systems and structures push us in certain ways that are not good for climate. I mean, you made the point about traveling for research, that's think twice about how you do that and why you do that and when you do that. Think twice about how much you make your students travel. How do we make this a more efficient? This also has other benefits that have nothing to do with climate change. It makes the system more accessible, more diverse as a result, because people can go to school in ways that are not possible right now.
These are two huge points, Tom. And just if I can connect your second point to Roxanne's point about libraries, increasing access to higher education. And again, I just want to give a shout out to libraries for playing a key role in that service, in that function. And to your first point, is this what you meant by fluid organization and fluid structures? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's stop putting every class on a schedule and say everybody has to be in English from 8 to 9:30 on campus. And oh, by the way, you have to drive there.
Some more hybrid or high flex teaching as a result. This is two brilliant thoughts, Tom. Thank you. And speaking of brilliance, Ruben Puentedora comes in and adds, it's important to reintegrate and revalorize international organizations. The United Nations and UNESCO may be imperfect, but they nonetheless provide some opportunities that otherwise go missing. Quite true. This is one potential area that we may see a lot of growth in. People have called for a UN 2.0, for example, to organize the huge complexity of all of this at the political level. But we can also think about UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals, which almost nobody in the US really pays a lot of attention to, but are very, very powerful around the world. And those map on very, very well onto climate justice. In fact, the newest IPCC report makes a key point of reiterating how each sustainable development goal can map onto individual climate actions. Great points, Ruben. Roxanne adds as well, cultivating student engagement is so vital to facilitating positive growth and change in our environmental climate challenges on campus and in online campuses. Yes, and I think what's one of the arguments in favor of the pedagogies I mentioned before, but we also may see that offering more climate programs, more climate classes and majors may be a way of meeting that engagement and increasing that engagement. I'd love to hear from folks who haven't had a chance to peep out so far. Folks like Emily, Melanie, Kelly, Gus, Bailey, and Jerry. What would you like to add? What came up in your notes and your ruminations? How does all this impact your academic work over the next, say, 5 or 10 years? Jerry, I can hear that your mic is on, but I can't hear any words from you. Stephanie asked, my book will be available roughly this winter. Stephanie, it depends on the supply chain. It'll be from Johns Hopkins University Press, and I'll share the word. Thank you for asking. Jerry, if your mic is having issues, just type in the chat and I'll read it out loud. And also Marvin and Gina, I didn't mean to leave you out. We'd love to hear what you think as well. And while those people are thinking, or perhaps running away at top speed, let me ask you another question, just to keep this rolling a little further and to keep you thinking about this. What does social justice look like in educational technology during the climate crisis? Think, for example, how do you connect anti-racist mentality to pedagogical practice, to educational technology in the context of the climate crisis? Millie, oh, I'm so sorry you're sick. My apologies. I don't mean to put you on the spot. I really hope you feel better. And above all, I hope it's not COVID. She adds that the biggest struggle for her institution is getting support and buy-in to make high-level changes. Sounds like an institution that's not really committed to this just yet. Sarah, it sounds like you have a small fire actually in front of you, giving that beautiful light. Well, I was told to end this at 15 minutes before the hour. It is now 10 minutes before the hour. So clearly I'm a disobedient host and presenter, which is quite true. That's very consistent for me. I'll just mention Tom added, actually Tom and Emily add 2 more comments. I want to share these quickly. Tom mentions that climate change magnifies inequity. Inequity, excuse me, not iniquity, that's a different thing. So good point, Tom, which means that our efforts to mitigate and adapt to it really have to take double steps in order to be able to address that. Emily's an institution where there's no buy-in for this yet. I hear that, Emily. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Roxanne. Well, this should be recorded. It's recording right now, so the recording should be available. Thanks to Ruben, we have live transcription, so that should be working right now. I believe there may be visual annotation of this, so I'll share that if that comes to be. And I'll post about this on my blog if anyone's curious. In the meantime, let me just thank you all for your participation in this lightning fast discussion. I really appreciate all your questions, thoughts, and ideas. And please think about this seriously. We may be in the first stage of a major movement sweeping higher education worldwide. And this would be a great time to start. Thank you all. There should be some kind of like thunderclap or a drum roll just to say, we're all over, we're all done. But
yeah,
thank you.
With Zoom, it tends to peter out rather than to smash out, unless the host ends it. At which point there is a thundercloud.
I was going to do that, but I just saw all of you here, and I wanted to just make sure I could say hi. Noah, I've got to say, you confused the heck out of me, because my representative to the House of Representatives is named Whitman, and sends me an email about once a day. And so I saw Whitman, I'm like, what's he doing here? And
Oh, sorry to haunt you.
no, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you for adding so much. I would love to follow up by email afterwards. I'd love to hear. I mean, Berkeley, I would expect to be on the cutting edge.
In some ways we are, and we're both inventing the future, and yet I expect, in pockets of the university, and I expect in other ways we'll be the last to see changes. When you have a very large, distributed, decentralized organization like UC Berkeley, ASU is going to be light years ahead of us in certain areas, right? Where you can affect top-down change, sometimes those experiments can happen, or even as we're seeing right here, which is the opposite of top-down change. The ShapingEDU is just an awesome network of folks coming together and sharing ideas. But one thing I think UC Berkeley is doing well is its focus on sort of connecting more to its mission of providing a discovery or inquiry-based experience and making that the centerpiece of undergraduate education. And it feels like that's something that I see really, when you talk about where we need to go in terms of, how in climate change, for example, where we need to focus, that will take care of it. Right? People will, if students are afforded access to, research-based experiences and are focusing on asking questions that haven't been answered yet, I think that will lead us into the future that we want to live in, right? The technology stuff, yeah, there are probably some bets we should be making that we're not making. That feels like that's going to be very disruptive, and that will probably come to us. We'll see ASU, we'll see other campuses doing really well in certain experiments and want to or be forced to adapt or adopt those changes, I think. So that's my quick take.
Well, that's a great take.
Yeah.
That's a great take. Thank you. You're putting it at ASU makes me think that among other things, they're in such an incredibly fragile point geographically, where there's this interesting question of how cities like Nevada or Phoenix, are they actually tenable? And would ASU, for example, down the road, flip entirely to being online, just because the face-to-face campus has become too expensive to maintain if they have to air condition the outdoors in order to survive? Not to say anything about the water problem. And then think about the University of Nevada, the Nevada area, where the Las Vegas community college system is absolutely enormous. What happens there? Much less in a place like, say, Salt Lake City, where there's already the danger of Salt Lake emitting poison into the air. So I love your point about students. In many ways, I have a lot of hopes for that. I think a lot of baby boomer faculty administrators are going to either get some kind of historical whiplash or feel right at home to have students pushing for transformation of the academy. But we have to look for that and in many ways embrace that.
I saw something the other day. It's like 150 feet of water loss on the lakes that power the Southwest, and
Lake Mead,
it's kind of game over. It's kind of game over for Southern, for Las Vegas, Southern California, and the Phoenix area, because they're going to lose. Not only are they going to have enough water, they're not going to have electricity.
Yeah. And then, if you'll forgive the pun, which actually works in this case, there are all kinds of downstream impacts of this. You think about, for example, down to Mexico. You think about the fights for all kinds of water issues. And right now, there's actually some interesting arguments in Africa along these lines.
But that's getting right back to the equity question you just said. I mean, Mexico was a write-off years ago already because we dried up the Colorado. They don't get any of that water anymore. And what power did they have to say no? Not much, right? And so that's, again, they're the harbinger of the future. Now it's just moving upstream.
as it were. Right? I mean,
I don't live in the Southwest either. So, I mean,
no, but I was mentioning along the Nile, there's this interesting problem that Ethiopia is building an enormous dam on the Nile,
right.
which then of course feeds Egypt. And so this is, for a lot of analysts, this is a spark for war. So to think about academics in all these different areas. If you're, for example, if you're a campus planner, a facilities manager, or you're a dean or a president, is this a safe place to have your campus anymore? Or should you think about just moving to another region, many miles away? Or if you're going to maintain, if you're committed to that for various reasons, how do you maintain water? Do you, institute extreme water rationing? Do you have water catchment? And to what extent do you have any room to maneuver? And are you basically at the whim of your local community? Friends, it's just about 2 o'clock on the East Coast, and that means they're going to probably want to use this slot for somebody else. I will follow up with each of you by email, and I will put more about this online. But thank you all for sharing.
That'd be great.
Much.
Great discussion, Brian. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all. You guys did all the work.
See you.
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.